The Battle of Latrun, 1940. The Battle of Latrun in 1948 occupy a unique and unsettling place in the history of Arab-Israeli war and in the broader struggle over Jerusalem. Unlike many other engagements of the war, Latrun was not defined by sweeping territorial conquest or dramatic breakthroughs. Instead, it was defined by repeated failure, stubborn resistance, and the brutal logic of geography. A single junction, a police fortress, and a narrow road through Judean hills became the focal point of a conflict that would shape not only the fate of Jerusalem but also a collective memory of war itself. Latrun demonstrated more clearly than almost any other battlefield in 1948 that strategic importance doesn't depend on size or symbolism alone, but on the core mechanics of supply, movement, and control. Latrun's importance stemmed from its position as stride the only reliable road linking to the coastal plain, Tel Aviv, and its hinterland to Jerusalem. In 1948, West Jerusalem was home to over 100,000 Jewish inhabitants surrounded by predominantly Arab-controlled territory. The city didn't produce enough food or water to sustain itself, nor could it rely on internal resources for weapons or medical supplies. Every sack of flour, every rifle, and every drop of fuel had to come by road. Latrun overlooked this road at its most vulnerable point, where it narrowed as it entered the hills. Whoever held Latrun could strangle Jerusalem without needing to occupy the city itself. This geographical reality transformed Latrun from a minor British police post into one of the most decisive positions of the entire war. In the months preceded the declaration of the State of Israel, Jerusalem was already under severe pressure. During the Civil War phase, following the United Nations partition plan, Arab forces repeatedly ambushed Jewish convoys attempting to reach the city. Villages were burned, vehicles were destroyed, drivers killed, and supplies lost. By early 1948, food rationing had become severe and morale in the city was fragile. Temporary relief came with operations that forced convoys through, but the problem was never solved. When the British withdrew in May and neighboring Arab states entered the war, the situation deteriorated further. The arrival of Jordanian Arab Legion marked a decisive escalation. Unlike irregular militias, the Legion was a professional, disciplined force trained and equipped along British lines, capable of holding and defending key terrain with precision. The Arab Legion's occupation of Latrun was swift and effective. Once entrenched, the Legion transformed the area into a layered defensive system, combining the fortified police station with trenches, machine gun nests, artillery support, and armored vehicles. Israeli intelligence underestimated both the strength and preparedness of these forces. This miscalculation would prove catastrophic. Israeli leaders faced an agonizing dilemma. Without reopening the road to Jerusalem, the city would eventually collapse, but any frontal assault on Latrun risked heavy casualties against a well-prepared defender. Political considerations further complicated this decision, as Latrun lay in territory allocated to the Arab state under the partition plan, and attacking it risked wider diplomatic consequences. Nonetheless, the urgency of Jerusalem's situation pushed Israeli leadership towards action. The first assault on Latrun, launched in late May 1948, set the tone for what would follow. Poor reconnaissance, inadequate coordination, and overconfidence combined with harsh realities of terrain and enemy fire. Many Israeli troops were newly arrived immigrants, with some with little or no military training, thrust into a complex night attack against a fortified position. The assault quickly unraveled. Surprise was lost, units became disoriented, and advancing soldiers found themselves exposed on open ground under machine gun and artillery fire. The retreat was as deadly as the attack itself, with wounded men left under the sun without water. The losses were severe. The objective The assault quickly unraveled. Surprise was lost. Units became disoriented, and advancing soldiers found themselves exposed on open ground under machine gun and artillery fire. The retreat was as deadly as the attack itself, with wounded men left under the sun and without water. The losses were severe, and the objective remained firmly in Jordanian hands. Subsequent Israeli attacks followed a similar pattern. Despite attempts to improve planning and coordination, each assault encountered the same fundamental problem. Latrun was literally suited for defense, and the Arab Legion exploited disadvantage skillfully. Even when Israeli forces managed to penetrate parts of the defensive perimeter or seize nearby positions, they could not sustain their gains under counterfire. The Jordanian defenders, by contrast, maintained discipline and effective communication and control of the battlefield. By the end of 5 major assaults, Israel had failed every time to capture Latrun. Hundreds of soldiers were killed or wounded, and the psychological impact on Israeli forces were profound. Latrun became synonymous with frustration, sacrifice, and the limits of military will. Yet the story of Latrun is not one of simple defeat. Strategically, Israel adapted. Faced with the impossibility of taking Latrun by force, Israeli commanders and engineers sought an alternative solution. South of the main road, through rugged hills and narrow paths, they identified a series of tracks that could be connected into a new supply route. What became known as the Burma Road was built under immense pressure, often at night, with men carrying supplies by hand before vehicles could pass. This improvised lifeline gradually allowed food, water, and weapons, as well as reinforcements, to reach Jerusalem. The siege was broken not by conquering Latrun, but by bypassing it. In this sense, Latrun forced innovation, demonstration that strategic flexibility had compensated for tactical failure. The human cost of these battles, however, left deep scars. Among the Israeli casualties were many recent immigrants and Holocaust survivors. Those participants later became a focal point of national debate. For some, Latrun symbolized heroic sacrifice, a necessary price paid to ensure Jerusalem's survival. For others, it represented tragic mismanagement and moral failure, where poorly prepared soldiers were sent into impossible conditions. These competing interpretations shaped Israeli historiography and collective memory for decades. Latrun became not just a battlefield, but a lens through which Israelis argued about leadership, responsibility, and ethics of nation building under existential threat. For Palestinians, the Latrun carries a different but equally painful significance. The battle took place amid wider displacement of Palestinian Arab communities during the war. Villages around Latrun were depopulated, some as residents fled fleeing, others through expulsions and demolitions that followed Israeli operations. These events became part of a broader Palestinian experience of dispossession in 1948. In Palestinian memory, Latrun is less about military maneuvers and more about loss of home and land, another chapter in the catastrophe that reshaped Palestinian history. Thus, Latrun sits at the intersection of multiple historical narratives, each emphasizing different dimensions of the same events. From a Jordanian perspective, Latrun stands as one of the Arabs' legion's greatest successes. Against repeated assaults by a numerically superior enemy, the legion held its ground and secured East Jerusalem and its approaches to it. The defense of Latrun became a point of pride in Jordanian military history, reinforcing the reputation of the legion as the most effective Arab force in the 1948 war. The success also had long-term consequences. Latrun remained under Jordanian control until 1967, shaping the geopolitical reality of the region for nearly 2 decades. Ultimately, the Battle of Latrun illustrates the complexity of war far beyond simple notations of victory and defeat. Tactically, Israel failed to capture its objective. Strategically, it achieved its overriding goal of keeping Jerusalem alive. Jordan successfully defended a key position and could not prevent Israel from adapting around it. Civilians on all sides paid the highest price through death, displacement, and lasting trauma. Latrun reminds us that war are not decided solely by battlefield outcomes, but by the interaction of geography, logistics, leadership, and the human resilience that matters the most. It remains one of the most instructive and haunting episodes of the 1948 war, where a single road came to embody the fate of a city and the birth pains of a conflict that still echoes today.